Hi everyone, this is Emma, the host of the Stories of Latter-day Faith channel. I'm so excited to present my very first interview with a Latter-day Saint convert who is just a wonderful, lovely human being that I have had the great pleasure of getting to know in my home ward. And she was so gracious and kind to agree to tell her story, to let me interview her. And I think that she did such a wonderful job, and I really hope that as people watch it, they feel the spirit the same way that I did when I listened to her tell her story. So I don't, like I said in my earlier videos, I don't want this to be about me. I want this to be about the people who I interview. And so without further ado, I'll introduce my dear friend Lori Hurley. Well, thank you for joining me tonight. I am so grateful that you decided to be my first victim of this podcast that I started. So I will let you introduce yourself. If you could just tell us a little bit about your background.
Wonderful. So, my name is Lori. I live in Minnesota. I was born and raised to goodly parents in Denver, Colorado. And we were a very good and devout Jewish family. So, my grandparents were Orthodox Jews. My own family, we would have been considered conservative. And I don't know how much you know about the layers of observance, but if Orthodox is the most observant, Reform would be the least observant. We were somewhere in the middle, holding true to the traditions and the rituals while also allowing for modern day living and conveniences.
Okay. So what before you were really introduced to the church, what did you know about the Latter-day Saint Church?
Absolutely nothing. So in my world, and probably back in those days, in our world, there's a bit of blinders. There's Jews, and then there's everybody else. And at least in my family, we don't care about anybody else. You're either a Jew or a Gentile. And if you're a Gentile, we don't care what brand of Gentile you are. You're either one of us or you're not. And if you're not, don't know, don't care. I had only met one other person who was a member of the church that I knew of, because mind you, didn't know, didn't care. In high school, there was a boy that had gone to another high school, and he and I were paired by our high schools to work on a debate, something for speech and debate, and it was something, the topic was international terrorism, and we were to do our research and come together at a multi-school event. And we spent half the time working on the project and the other half really getting to know each other. He turned out to be quite great. And then I later learned he was a member of that church with a really long name. But again, he wasn't a Jew, so it didn't matter to me.
Okay. So I guess how were you first introduced to the church? Like,
So that would be the first
so there's
introduction. I
him,
just didn't
but
know, right? But the real introduction came in my early 20s, when I met and fell in love with a member of the church who was actually working his way back, and he was very faithful. And I was still very devoutly Jewish, but on my own journey of sorts. And we met, and I was learning a lot about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from him. Even though I didn't personally have an interest in it, we agreed that if we were going to continue in a relationship, I would learn about his beliefs and he would learn about mine, because if we were going to proceed in our lives and we were in love, it would be important to have some shared values. We didn't have to be the same, but it would be important to understand what the other person believed.
okay. So As you started to be introduced to the church in that more significant way, what were some of your like first impressions of Latter-day Saints and the Latter-day Saint Church?
So actually, I had some amazing experiences. Like they were all so positive. This friend of mine, his name is Scott, invited me to spend some time with his family. And I stayed for a few days. I'm sleeping on the couch. And I remember that they'd get up early at like 5 in the morning to invite the entire family together to kneel in prayer. And I thought that was really unusual, but it was really sweet. And I remember that it felt really good. Like, I had to kind of like nobody's watching and it felt really good. There was such a sweetness to that experience. And even to my friend Scott as well. I did not end up marrying, of course, but we are still good friends. Even back then, he truly was at the time one of the kindest, most generous and hopeful and optimistic people I had ever met. And I remember thinking, you know, I want what he's got. I want what he's on. What's that Kool-Aid you're drinking? No, what is that? And he would always credit it back to his faith, but he really was one of the nicest people I'd ever met. And that wasn't my experience growing up, separate from religion. I wasn't raised, number one, in a household that was kind. I wasn't raised in a household that where people were generous and who would give without any expectation of anything in return. And he just embodied generosity. And he would always attribute it to his church. And I would always say, no, 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 that's just you. That's just you. But experience after experience with every member of his family, and then later on, I met some of his friends. There was just this consistency of kindness and joy. And probably one of the things I liked the best, and I didn't add this to my story, so I'm going to give you let me go back to go forward, is growing up as a Jew in Denver. And then later we moved to New Mexico, where I was probably one of only two or three Jews in my high school. I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of there was a lot of Jewish hate. And it was something I didn't understand because it was foreign. People would call me Christ killer. And there were some other derogatory words that people would use towards me. And I was really confused by it. And then there was this group in high school at lunchtime. There was I won't name it because I think it's still around, but there was a Christian youth group that had a little white van that would pull up at lunchtime. We had an open campus, so you could go away for lunch, and they would drive us to the nearest Wendy's, Taco Bell, whatever. We'd all get in the van, and I was invited to come along. And one of my best friends was in the group, so I was invited to come along. And what I didn't know until years later was that the only reason they invited me was because it was their hope to save me, because I was going to hell for not believing in Jesus Christ. And, when I would be up at the counter buying my lunch, or if I excused myself to go to the restroom or something, they would all be praying for me, praying that their poor fallen friend, Lori, would see the light and would be saved. And later on, I would end up having some one-on-one conversations with people about religion. I thought they were just interested in Jewish people. No, they weren't interested in Jews. It was their personal mission to rescue me. And that felt a little odd to me. And I would say, and I didn't know who Jesus was. And for any of your viewers who don't know what Jews believe, for Jews, there is no Old and New Testament. There is only the Hebrew Bible, which, by the way, contains the Old Testament. There's no New Testament because it stops there. In its simplest terms, you could say that what Jews are waiting for, Jews are still waiting for the Messiah to come. They do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. A good man, maybe a good teacher, but not the promised Messiah. And you could say that what Jews are waiting for from the first coming is very much what Christians are waiting for from the second coming. So to have these people have so much hatred towards me and so much, treating me like I was so broken was really hurtful. And maybe the biggest hurt, and this is close to me. So you can see I'm already getting a little verklempt right here. My mother died when I was 9. And, it was nobody ever, there was no Christians in my life to say anything about it. So it wasn't until high school that people would say things like, well, your mom is in a hell, right? What? My mother was a really good Jew, and Jews don't preach a hell theology. It's not a Jewish, that's not a thing for Jews, all right? And or at least it wasn't when I was growing up. I don't know if it is now. But, to say things like that my mother, who was a good, observant Jew, would be in hell. It's like, what a horrible thing to say. And then I was going there too, because I didn't believe in this guy named Jesus. I used to say back, look, if your Jesus is so forgiving, he'll forgive me for not believing in him. Well, fast forward in my story, there I've met Scott, I've met his family, I've met his friends, and they're so excited to be around me. There's not an ounce of anti-Semitism. There's not an ounce of, yeah, oh, you poor thing. They don't feel sorry for me. They're the first Christians I ever met that didn't treat me or tell me directly that I was going to hell for not believing in Jesus Christ. And when I brought that to their attention, they're like, "What? People told you that?" Like, no, that they're wrong. That's confusion. That's not correct, and that is not our doctrine. And so you can imagine that would open me up when I was ready to learn about Jesus Christ. I was learning about Jesus Christ not to fix my terrible life that was broken, but because maybe there was something more to learn about, and I was going to be fine with or without him.
Wow. It's an incredible story. Thank you. I'm so sad that you went through that, and so happy that you didn't find that here with the church. So
Yeah.
that makes me happy. Um, so what kind of made you go from being intrigued and interested to actually deciding to become a Latter-day Saint?
So prior to meeting my friend Scott, I had traveled around the world with an international performing group. And we were 130 people from 18 different countries thrown together for an entire year where we would be in 86 different cities. We stayed in host families, we performed in a show, um, and we got to know each other. We were all from different backgrounds, and the intent of this group was to basically bring world peace through understanding. By taking a group of people from around the world and sending us around the world, we would learn a lot. And then in our that was the outward facing, and the inward facing, we were also learning about each other. And early in our tour, there were only like 4 or 5 Jewish people in my cast, and we were invited to do a presentation to the cast on Judaism, like just to teach. No intent to convert. We're all about learning, peace through understanding. We're going to learn about each other so that we can make this world a better place. And so we all got together, and you have to know, I'm a devout Jew, and I'm a proud Jew. I went to Hebrew school throughout my life. I had a bat mitzvah. My family was faithful, and even though my family was less observant after my mom died, I still identify as a Jew. I mean, it is my heritage. It is my upbringing. It is it has always been a source of strength for me. Well, there I am sitting around the table with other Jews, and it is our job to tell people what Jews believe. And we fought and we argued and we couldn't agree. And that got my attention. And I'm sitting around the table with other good and devout Jews. Well, do Jews believe this or do Jews believe that? I always had it that I was right, that my way of seeing God through my Jewish filter was the way it was. And I believe that probably all the people around that table with me would have felt the same. And it just started an inquiry for me. It's like, wait a minute, they're a good Jew, they're a good Jew, they're a good Jew, I'm a good Jew. How come we don't agree Okay, well, it's fine. We did our presentation. Everything was fine. And hey, we wouldn't be the first Jews who debated. If you ever watch a yeshiva and you watch them going at it, it is a hardy subject to discern the interpretation. So all is well.
Yeah, I mean, the
Well,
whole
fast
Talmud
forward.
is them debating with each other.
Exactly, exactly. So fast forward in my tour, every now and again I would be placed with a Jewish host family. And there's a kinship. You meet another Jew, you feel like kin. You meet another, you stay in a family if there's a connection. And there I was. I believe I was in might have been in Belgium, maybe. And I'm with a Jewish family, and they have a Christmas tree. Now, I know we're not supposed to judge, but I'm sitting there judging, and I'm judging our what are they doing with a Christmas tree? They're Jews. Don't we have enough issues? Do we really have to be catering to the rest of the world? And I had this dialogue like, but you're Jews. Why do you have a Christmas tree? And I don't remember what the answer was. And then there was another family that, you know, they were Jews and they served us bacon. For any of your viewers who don't know, Jews don't eat pork. And this Jewish family is serving bacon. Now, it's up to me whether I choose to or not to eat bacon. But, if I ate bacon, at least I felt guilty about it. This family, there was no guilt, there was no whatever. So it started my wheels turning. And I've started thinking about my own religion, and I was thinking a lot about my relationship with God. I've always believed in God. I've never doubted God. And I got to thinking about what I believe. Now, at the same time, I'm also surrounded by people of all faiths, people of no faith. Um, Fast forward, we ended up in the deep South, and for our very first night in this particular host family, we'd only stay with host families 2 or 3 days at most. This particular night, you know, after the experiences I was having, I was deciding that I was going to be even more a devout Jew. And I was just going to, if I was going to be a Jew, I was going to be a good Jew. And our host mother served us this beautiful glazed ham. All right. Well, I helped myself to the potatoes. I helped myself to the side vegetables. I had some bread. And this woman, and again, we're in the deep South, she said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were a vegetarian." And I said, "Well, no, actually, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm Jewish, and Jews don't eat pork." Now, you would have thought that she had invited Satan to her table. She got a little twitchy and a little uncomfortable. And she's like, "So you don't believe in Jesus?" I was like, "No, no, no, I don't. We're still waiting for the Messiah." And this made her so visibly uncomfortable. Like everyone else was like eating silently. And there we are, this woman and I, and I'm sure she was a good woman, but she was so uncomfortable with me there. And she kept trying to, "But don't you know this? And don't you know that?" And then she would leave the table. And I know she was calling for the advance team to see if there was a way to trade me with somebody else. But this is long before cell phones, long before, you know, online directories. There was no one she could reach. The office was closed. And for like 2 hours, I sat at this table where she told me all the bad things that Jews had ever done, how I was a Christ killer. I mean, again, it was like high school all over again, only worse. And and again, she was like, "Well, in my church, we have this organization called Jews for Jesus." And I said, "That's kind of a contradiction in terms, because if I'm a Jew, it means I'm not actually for Jesus, but thanks." I was a little snarky. Um, so fast forward, that didn't go very well. And then I was sharing this with some members of my cast. And I kept saying, what is it with this Jesus guy? And why is everybody so mad at me about it? And I was able to have some of my first positive experiences with Christians in general. I don't think there were any Latter-day Saints in my cast. If there were, I didn't know. Did I mention that there's Jews and everybody else? Anyhow, I started doubting and questioning my own belief. Suddenly, it wasn't that I was going to suddenly become a Christian, but now I was around Jews I couldn't agree with. I'm around Jewish host families that aren't observant. And it started me on a quest to decide whether or not God was real at all. Did God make man, or did man invent God? Because I got to thinking, if God tells me don't eat pork, then why do I decide whether or not I obey? If I believe in God, shouldn't I do everything he says? And this started me on a journey where I was either going to become an atheist or I was going to become an Orthodox Jew. I was done being reformed. I was ready to either be all in and be true to my word. It was going to be an integrity issue for me. I was going to be my word. I was going to embody what I believed. Or if it turns out man made God, well, then I can do whatever I want and I can eat pork and stop feeling guilty about it, right? And so I started meeting with rabbis to ask them questions. So before I ended up meeting my friend Scott, I really do believe that the Lord had been preparing me for this dialogue because when I met my friend Scott, I was already on this journey. Now, again, it didn't matter if he was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or anything else. It was just quite fortunate that he was so great. So uh, during the time we actually got engaged, and during that time we were engaged when we gone our separate ways, I was living in Albuquerque. He was living in Bountiful, Utah. I I went back to Albuquerque, and we'd had this agreement to learn about each other's religions. And I remember the boy in high school. I remember there was a boy I knew in high school from another school who was a member of a church from a really long name. I think this might be the same church. I looked in the phone book. If any of your viewers are too young, a phone book is a really big book with a lot of really small words where we get people's names and numbers. There was no Google, and I looked up. I found their number. I called their house. His mother answered the phone. I said, "Hi, my name is Lori. I don't know if you remember me. I did a debate presentation with your son like 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and she didn't remember me." And I said, "Hey, you're a Mormon, aren't you?" She said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, is there any way I can learn more about your church?" When does that ever happen, right? And it turns out that she owns or owned the only LDS bookstore in Albuquerque. What are the
Oh,
chances?
wow.
So she said, "Why don't you come on down? I'll hook you up." So I go down. I meet with her. She's also just so lovely, and she gives me a copy of the Book of Mormon. She gives me Marvelous Work and a Wonder. She gives me Truth Restored, and she gives me. And then she says, "Oh, do you want me to send you a couple missionaries?" Now you have to know that that's even a word. I didn't really know what that meant when she said, "Send me and what's your address?" I thought that was like a Mormon monthly magazine. So I give the address and she's like, "All right, let's set the appointment." It's like, "What appointment?" "To meet with the missionaries." "Oh, wait, I'm sorry. What's a missionary again?" And she tells me, "Well, these are people who will come and teach you." I'm like, "Ooh, okay, probably not kosher to meet with missionaries in my house. Don't send them to me. We'll have to figure out another way." And so she agreed to host the missionary discussions. So I had all my paraphernalia in hand, and she said something that got my attention that I've never forgotten. She said, "I want you to read this Book of Mormon, but I want you to make me a promise." She said, "Don't pray about it unless you want to find out that it's true." Well, that was an interesting thing. Don't pray about it unless I want to find out if it's true. I never forgot that. It's like, huh. So I don't know if I answered your question. So that was the kind of the spiritual mental preparation that led up to me really being in a position to learn about the church.
Hmm. So what was the thing that like pushed you over the edge and said, "Yep, I'm in. I'm gonna do this."
Okay, so here's the rest of the story. So I started meeting with missionaries, and back in those days, there was no preach my gospel. Back in those days, there were distinct discussions. There were six of them, distinct discussions that got memorized and executed. And I believe the first discussion was Joseph Smith and the Joseph Smith story. And I sat there and I kept saying, "That's a really great story. If I was already a Christian, I'd have no problem believing in your religion. My issue is not whether Joseph Smith is a prophet in your church is true. My issue is Jesus Christ the Messiah?" And those poor missionaries were not prepared to have that dialogue. And the woman who owned the bookstore, in whose home I was having these discussions, was also not prepared for that dialogue. It was hard for any of them to understand um, why I couldn't just accept Jesus as my Messiah. They say, but he atoned for our sins. I said, yeah, but I'm a Jew. We atone for our own sins. We have the holiday of, we have the head of the new year at Rosh Hashanah. And then 10 days later, we have our day of atonement, Yom Kippur. What do I need Jesus for? And it was a very difficult, it was a difficult dialogue. And those poor missionaries weren't prepared. This sweet woman wasn't prepared. Let's just say my discussions didn't go very well. Let's just say I was steadfast and immovable. So fast forward, I ended up in Japan, also orchestrated by the Lord. And you know what's in Japan in abundance? Missionaries. They're everywhere. And they're taller than everybody. And I got kind of excited. I still had a soft spot for missionaries. Just because I didn't agree with them doesn't mean I didn't enjoy being with them. And at the time, I am now engaged to my friend Scott, and he's in Japan too. And so we agreed to start meeting with missionaries. Now here's Providence for you. In Japan, they did not have the same 6 discussions because Japan, the Japanese people are not a Judeo-Christian culture. So in their discussions, the missionaries started with, who is God? And it was more of a King Lamoni experience. It didn't start with Joseph Smith's story, didn't start with Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. It started with, who is God? And that's a conversation I could have. And I always feel like the Lord put me there to have that dialogue because I knew God. And so I met with missionaries. I met with a lot of missionaries. I met with missionaries for the better part of 9 months while I was in Japan. And my issue, I was reading the Book of Mormon. I was meeting with them. I was actually praying, and in my heart of hearts, it felt good. But I was looking for an answer. I wanted the answer to the question, is Jesus the Messiah? And the missionaries kept bringing me back to Moroni's promise. You remember Moroni's promise? If you'll pray, having real intent, having faith in Christ, the truth will be made known unto you. And I would say, yeah, but I don't have faith in Christ. Does that mean my answer won't come, or that the answer is no? And they just kept saying, well, just keep praying. And so I was not successful with them. Well, fast forward, I get back home. I'm back in Albuquerque. I am at an event at the New Mexico State Fair, and I'm stationed maybe 50 feet from a booth that is sponsored by, guess what? The missionaries. And I get kind of excited. I'm like, missionaries, I love missionaries. So I go on over, and of course, they're happy to talk to anybody. And it's like, oh, I've been meeting with missionaries for a whole year now. And they're like, really? Well, what? Well, how come? And why aren't you baptized? Even they didn't say that, but they're like, oh, well, tell us about you. And I told them a little bit about my story. And they said, well, would it be okay if we started meeting with you? I'm like, sure. And it just so happens, this is Albuquerque, all right? There's a lot of people in Albuquerque. It just so happens that the missionaries who happened to be manning the booth at exactly that time that I was there happened to exactly be the missionaries in the ward where I would attend based on where I lived. Do, 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 do. That is so good at micromanaging things. So I get to now I should say it, I should also say these are sister missionaries, and I've never met with sisters before. And I started meeting with them. And again, they were quite lovely. And here's the turning point. Are you ready? Here's the turning point. About a year earlier, while I was on this quest, while I was meeting with missionaries earlier before I was in Japan, I was meeting with a rabbi simultaneously because I did like what I was hearing, but I was kind of stuck at the whole Jesus thing. And I would talk to the rabbi about that. And I talked to him, I asked him about Jesus, and he said, look, I asked him about the crucifixion and about the resurrection and about what happens after we die. And he said, well, no, he said, nobody's ever died and come back to tell us. Well, except Jesus, but he didn't like that. Anyway, I had gone to a high holiday service for Yom Kippur, and there was a story that, and this is later on now, I'm back in Albuquerque. I've gone to Yom Kippur. I've gone to my services because I'm still ready to be a devout Jew, an Orthodox Jew. And the rabbi tells this story. It gets told in many forms. It's the first time I'd heard the story. So I'll give you the abbreviated version. You'll recognize it when you hear it, about the man in the fishing boat. And He's in his fishing boat. He notices a hole in the boat. The water's starting to fill. He starts to pray. Dear God, I've been a good man. I've raised a good family. My boat, I'm in jeopardy. Please save me. Well, immediately this fishing boat goes on by. Says, hey, do you need any help? He says, no, no, thank you. I'm praying to my Lord. My Lord will save me. So the fishing boat goes on by. In the meanwhile, the water is rising. He's praying even more fervently, God, please help me. I'm in danger here. Help me. And then a helicopter hovers overhead and they call out and say, hey, do you need any help? He says, no, no, thank you. I'm praying to my Lord. My Lord will save me. Helicopter flies on by. Okay, now the guy's treading water. Boat is long gone. He's treading water. He's still praying. Why are you, why aren't you helping me? I raised a good family. We're good Jews. We've done everything we're supposed to. Please, please help me. And then a yacht comes by. They're about to throw him a life preserver. Do you need any help? He says, no, no, thank you. I'm praying to my Lord. My Lord will save me. Well, of course, the man drowns. He gets up to wherever he goes. He's face to face with his maker. He's like, look, I was a good Jew. I raised a good family. Why did you abandon me in my time of need? And the Lord's answer was, look, I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. What more did you want? Now, at the time, the rabbi's message was, when you pray, listen for the answers. But suddenly, I started to think differently about that sermon and that story. I got to thinking about how throughout history, the Jews have been praying for their Messiah. The Jews have been praying for a deliverer. What if Jesus was who he said he was? It wouldn't be the first time the Jews had shunned a prophet. What if? So this was on my mind. I shared it with this sister missionary who, at the moment, said, Lori, what were you thinking just now? As I told that story, I said, well, I don't know. Actually, while I was thinking about that story, I was actually picturing myself telling that story in front of a group of people. She said, Lori, so was I. Is really? And immediately, Emma, I had goosebumps. Immediately, my eyes started to well up. And she's like, Lori, what are you feeling right now? I said, I don't know. I got goosebumps and I'm a little teary. She said, that's it. That's your answer. That's your answer. Like this. This is my answer. She's like, yes. She's like, that's your answer. Know that it's true, don't you? Jesus is the Messiah. And in that moment, I knew. And I knew that that was my answer. And I probably had these feelings before, but I never had anybody to point them out, to label them for me. I was waiting for lightning to strike, or I don't know what I was waiting for. But my chest was hot, my arms, my everything, everything fell into place, and it felt good, and it felt really, really right. And I agreed to get baptized about a week later. And it is the best decision I've ever made. And I feel grateful to have made that decision. And when I look in the rearview mirror and I look at all the areas of my life that aligned to get me to that point, I know that I was supposed to be here and I'm supposed to be all in. And I'll tell you what, I am probably a better Jew than I have ever been. I am devout. I am Orthodox. I am believing. I am a Jew for Jesus. I will never stop being a Jew. According to my grandmother, you're a Jew. You're born a Jew. You'll die a Jew. I am a Jew and I am a disciple of Christ.
I was so just wow. I just don't even have words. So we only have about 3 minutes left before it's done. Just want to ask one last question. So if someone was investigating the church and they saw your video, what is something you'd want them to know about your church and how it's affected your life?
Oh, the thing I like about my church is that it provides a structure to to live life in a way that is virtuous and wholesome, filled with service, filled with hope and positivity. And it is filled with flawed, rotten human beings just like me. It is filled with people who are imperfect. Okay, I shouldn't say rotten. We're not rotten. It is filled with people who are perfect. It is filled with people who just want to do the right thing, who make mistakes, who are clumsy, who fall down and get back up, people who sin, people who hurt, and people who just want to be close to God in all of our perfection. The church has so much good. So if someone is looking at the church, look at the covenants, look at the doctrine, read that Book of Mormon, pray about it. And if you choose to join us, know that you're not joining a group of people that has all the answers. You're joining a group of people who are just trying to find their way like you are. And please don't judge this church on the people. I hope nobody ever judges the church by meeting me. Oh my goodness, I would feel so sad if people decided that all Mormons were a particular way after meeting me. Oh, please don't do that. My covenants are with God. It was God that I was trying to get close to, not people. The church has just provided a great framework. I've raised my family in it, and I can't think of a more joyful way to spend my life for all of its imperfections.
Wow, it was so well said. Thank you so much again for agreeing to do this, and thanks for telling your story. I hope people enjoy it, and I will let you know what they say when they watch it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for all the good that you do, Emma. You are just a gift. You are such a gift, and I'm so grateful that I know you.
That's very sweet. I don't. Okay, go away now.
Thank
Have fun
you.
with the missionaries. Tell them I said hi.
I will do that. Bye-bye.